Welcome to the Clean Energy Transition Institute's inaugural webinar, which is launching our series of decarbonization forums. My name is Eileen Quigley, and I use she, her pronouns. I am CETI's Executive Director, and I am delighted to have all of you with us today. Before we get underway, I would like to acknowledge that I'm standing on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded land of the Coast Salish people. And that includes the Suquamish, the Duwamish, and the Stillaquamish tribes. I recognize and I honor their history and their past and ongoing stewardship. I also acknowledge their history of dispossession and forced removal, and I respect their rights to sovereignty and self-determination. Today, you're going to be hearing from several CETI team members. CETI's research analyst, Ruby Moore-Bloom, will give you a brief overview of CETI's programs. CETI's research fellow, Jade Sauvé, will present today's program on demystifying emissions accounting. Jade is a PhD candidate in oceanography at the University of Washington, and she's been affiliated with CETI for several years now. CETI's research consultant, Elizabeth Wilmot, is also joining us here today. She was previously the carbon program director at Microsoft and has been advising us on this project. And now I'm going to turn the mic over to Jamie Potasek. And Jamie is CETI's communications director, and she's going to review the logistics for how to participate in today's webinar. Thank you all so very much for coming.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Eileen. Before we dive in, just a few notes on participating in this webinar in case you are not all too familiar with Zoom. We are recording the event, and the recording as well as the slide deck will be shared with you in a follow-up email within the next week. We're going to be posting a few links and resources in the chat throughout the webinar, which you can navigate to in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A function to ask any questions as they arise throughout the presentation. The Q&A box can be accessed in that same toolbar. We will have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar, but our team will also do our best to answer any questions we're able to during the presentation, so no need to wait until the end to ask your questions as they arise. If your question is about a particular slide, we would really appreciate it if you can try to note the slide number so we can more easily address it. And the slides are going to be numbered in the top right-hand corner, as you can see on the slide right here. And if you do put a question in the chat, somebody from our team will probably message you and ask you to put it in the Q&A box. So just please try to put it in there directly. Closed captioning for this event can be turned on by clicking Show Captions and then View Full Transcript, again, in that same Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And if you're having trouble finding any of those features, sometimes there can be a button with 3 little dots on it. And if you click that, more options should pop up. And finally, if you have any technical difficulties, please feel free to message me in the chat and I'll do my best to help you. Now for a quick preview of today's agenda, as Eileen mentioned, Ruby Moore-Bloom is going to kick us off with some background on CETI and our work. Jade will then present, and her presentation is going to begin and end with a quick survey just to test how much we all learned together over the course of this presentation. We'll explain that in more detail here shortly. And then we will finish with a Q&A session that Eileen will moderate. We'll address as many questions as we're able to live. And then in addition to the slides and the recording, we're going to send out a full transcription of the Q&A. So it will include all questions that we answer live and all questions we didn't answer with vetted answers for each of them so we can get all that information to you all. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ruby.
Thank you, Jamie. Good to be here with everyone. My name is Ruby Moore-Bloom. I use she, her pronouns, and I'll kick us off with a quick introduction to the Clean Energy Transition Institute. I know Jade brought some University of Washington folks to this webinar, and there may be other new folks to CETI, so welcome to everyone. We are an independent, nonpartisan research and analysis nonprofit whose mission is to accelerate an equitable transition to a clean energy economy in the Northwest, so Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. We provide neutral data, analytics, and best practices about decarbonization to enable fact-based conversations among stakeholders and policymakers about the smartest strategies, actions, and policies to pursue to decrease carbon emissions as swiftly and as equitably as the climate science tells us we must. We have several program areas that we work in to accelerate an equitable clean energy transition. So we have our energy pathways work. We have projects around decarbonizing buildings and industry, as well as rural clean energy development. And then we also have a project called the Northwest Clean Energy Atlas, which is an interactive data visualization platform that provides regional policymakers tools to explore energy data relevant to deep decarbonization in the Northwest. And you'll see links to some of our work on the following, or on this slide once we post the slide deck. We have 3 different websites that you can explore. The main website for CETI's work is on the left there, cleanenergytransition.org. We also have a website dedicated to a recent project called Net Zero Northwest that was a deep decarbonization pathways project looking at pathways to net zero emissions in the 4 Northwest states. And so that URL is in the middle there. And then on the right is the website for the Northwest Clean Energy Atlas, which is the data visualization platform that I mentioned. This webinar is part of a new series, a new CETI series that is our Decarbonization Forum series. And the goal of this series is to explain various clean energy transition challenges to guide decision-making for policymakers and people engaged in the transition from fossil to clean energy. We will hold both virtual presentations like today's webinar, as well as in-person convenings throughout 2025. And we will accompany these forums with research and analysis summaries to further help Northwesterners explore issues with accelerating an equitable clean energy transition. If you are not already on our newsletter list, please sign up to receive notifications about these forums, as well as other program updates. And that link is in the chat. Thank you, Jamie. Now I am very excited to introduce Jade Sauvé, a CETI research fellow who has been working with us for a few years, starting as a research fellow through the University of Washington's ACORN program, and now working with us and completing her capstone project for the Program on Climate Change certificate. The capstone emphasizes communication. So Jade has prepared a survey. As Jamie mentioned, you'll take a survey at the beginning and at the end to evaluate the effectiveness of her communication. Jade will tell you a little bit more about the survey, but the questions are a good preview of what she will cover in her presentation, and we really appreciate your help here. I will pass it over to Jade.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ruby, for the lovely introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. And thank you for your help in meeting my capstone project requirements by answering this short survey. So this is what we will start with today. You can find the survey at the link in the chat or at this QR code here. As Ruby said, these questions are kind of a preview of what we'll be talking about today. So you're definitely not expected to know the answers at this point. So feel free to write, I don't know, or take your best guess. All the surveys will be anonymous. And we'll take 5 minutes starting now so that everyone has some time to fill in the survey. Thank you. All right, so it's been 5 minutes. Thank you to everyone who participated and helped me with my capstone project, and let's get started. All right, so let's get into the meat of this presentation and together demystify greenhouse gas emissions accounting methods. So my goal today is that you will leave this webinar with a good understanding of the most commonly used emissions accounting methods, along with their strengths and limitations to hopefully inform your work in the climate space. I will start with some context necessary for producing emissions inventories. I will then get into the different accounting methods, which are separated into 2 categories. First, we have jurisdictional emissions accounting, which encompasses production-based, sector-based, and consumption-based accounting. And then we'll talk about corporate emissions accounting for companies and organizations. And we'll finish up with some conclusions. All right, so let's start with some context by considering emissions accounting and its link with climate science. So, why do we do carbon accounting? Well, to address the existential threat that climate change presents to a livable planet, global leaders have agreed to try to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. If we want to succeed in this goal, we need to significantly decrease our emissions of greenhouse gases, eventually reaching net zero emissions. And so emissions accounting is necessary at all scales, so from product supply chains to national inventories, all the way up to atmospheric concentrations, in order to track our progress towards our emissions target and to support decarbonization policies and investment strategies. The measure of our success will be when atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases will first stabilize and then start decreasing. The graph you see here on the right tracks the atmospheric concentration of CO2 since the 1950s. These measurements are taken at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. We can clearly see the increasing trend over the whole record, with the little wiggles being the effect of seasons. While CO2 is the most common greenhouse gas, robust greenhouse gas inventories must also account for a range of other greenhouse gases, such as methane, nitrous oxide, etc. On the left here, we can see a pie chart showing the relative contribution of each greenhouse gas to total emissions. These gases, though, they differ both in their ability to warm the planet and also in the length of time they stay in the atmosphere. So to illustrate that, let's consider two different types of greenhouse gases: cumulative greenhouse gases and short-lived greenhouse gases. I'll walk you through the differences between them using this graph on the right that shows the change in the global temperature due to 1 year of emissions of CO2 in blue and methane in orange. So let's say we emit 1 year's worth of CO2. About 25% will be quickly taken up by the ocean, and another 25% by the land biomass. So that's plant, soils, etc. The 50% that's left over in the atmosphere is cumulative. So that means it will stay in the atmosphere for centuries. Also, global temperatures will continue to increase as long as we emit CO2 and will only start decreasing once we start removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And so this is why we must hit net zero by 2050. Methane, as a short-lived greenhouse gas, has a shorter lifetime in the atmosphere than CO2, but a stronger warming impact. What does this mean? Well, when we emit methane, we see stronger warming in the years immediately following the emissions than we do with CO2. This is because one molecule of methane can trap more heat than one molecule of CO2. However, within a decade or so, most of the methane will have been naturally removed from the atmosphere. And so you see how these different gases can impact global warming in different ways. To combine all greenhouse gases into one ledger, it is necessary to create a metric to convert the contribution of non-CO2 greenhouse gases into CO2 equivalent. The most commonly used metric right now is called the global warming potential over 100 years, commonly known as its acronym GWP 100. GWP 100 measures how much energy 1 ton of greenhouse gas emissions will absorb over a period of 100 years relative to 1 ton of CO2 emissions. We can see in the graph in the center here the GWP 100 for the different greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide has a GWP 100 of 1. This makes sense since it's the reference gas. Methane has a GWP 100 of 25, which means that 100 years after emission, one molecule of methane will have absorbed 25 times as much heat as one molecule of CO2. GWPs are important because, as you can see, while the quantity of methane or nitrous oxide that we emit is much less than for CO2, their ability to warm the climate is much more important. And so emissions of these gases are still significant. This metric, GWP 100, is good at representing the total warming impact of a particular gas over 100 years. However, it can fail to accurately represent the warming impact of some gases over either shorter or longer timescales. Since we want to reach net zero in less than 100 years, this can have strong implications for the perceived timing of net zero or for the amount of CO2 removals that would be necessary to offset activities with high non-CO2 emissions, particularly methane, like agriculture. So this is something to keep in mind if you're thinking about these industries that have a lot of non-CO2 emissions. Other metrics that attempt to remediate these issues with GWP 100 do exist, but they're not currently widely used. Okay, so one last piece of context that we need here is that there are also different types of CO2 emissions. Most emissions accounting framework distinguish between biogenic and fossil emissions of CO2 due to the different ways they interact with the global carbon cycle. Biogenic carbon is contained in biomass, so plants, trees, soil, etc., and was originally captured by photosynthesis from the atmosphere. Processes that break down biomass, it could be natural decomposition or combustion, produce biogenic emissions, returning that carbon to the atmosphere. Fossil fuels, on the other hand, contain carbon that had been sequestered in the Earth's crust for millions of years. And so fossil fuel combustion and industrial processes produce non-biogenic fossil fuel emissions, releasing that carbon into the atmosphere. All right. Now that we have some context for how different types of emissions impact atmospheric warming, we can think about the different ways to produce emissions inventories. When we create a greenhouse gas emission inventory at a scale smaller than the whole planet, we first must determine how to assign responsibility for a certain set of emissions. What I mean by that is, if a group is trying to produce their emissions inventory, they first have to decide which emissions they will be counting as theirs. In the case of jurisdictional emissions accounting, our first section, we're usually talking about national or subnational governments accounting for the emissions under their jurisdiction. There are several methods used to do emissions accounting that determine which emissions are under a certain government's jurisdictions in different ways. We will start first with production-based accounting. This method accounts for emissions produced within a geographical region. That is, emissions are assigned to the jurisdiction where the greenhouse gas enters the atmosphere. Production-based accounting is a useful tool for national and subnational governments because it provides information on emissions over which jurisdictions may have legal authority. Clear geographic boundaries also help avoid double counting emissions, and these inventories are typically based on direct emissions reporting or fuel consumption measurements, which can lead to lower uncertainty. However, production-based accounting does not capture the effects of carbon leakage. This is when territories lower their emissions by shutting down carbon-intensive processes within their home territory while still importing carbon-intensive products from outside their territory. In effect, the jurisdiction has moved the location of emissions, but has not actually decreased emissions overall. The method used by the signatories of the Paris Agreement is an excellent example of production-based accounting. Countries are required to report greenhouse gas emissions that enter the atmosphere on their territories. So for the US, that is all emissions produced on US land, including overseas territories. Emissions are separated into sector. The biggest contribution is the energy sector, as you can see in blue here on the graph. This encompasses all emissions resulting from the production of energy, from burning fuel in vehicles, to electricity generation from coal or natural gas. So those are the blue bars here on the graph. In red, we have the agriculture sector, and this includes emissions like methane from soil management or from cattle, for example. In orange, we have the waste sector, so that could include emission from wastewater or from solid waste in landfills. The sector for industrial processes and product use is concerned by emissions that occur due to the chemical reaction that arise in several different industries. So for example, you could have the CO2 emissions that come from cement manufacturing. Finally, we have the land use change, and forestry sector. This is the purple bar down here in the negative part of the graph, as well as this really tiny green bar at the very top. So this sector is concerned with emissions and removals of CO2, as well as emissions of methane and nitrous oxide from managed lands in the United States. Emissions from this sector are not included in the US gross emissions because they are considered biogenic emissions. However, land use change, and forestry is included in the net US emissions, and so offsetting some of the emissions from the other sectors, since this purple bar here is negative. Method development at the IPCC level is very thorough and is ultimately approved and unanimously agreed upon by all parties. This can make updates to the method very time-consuming, and it can mean that the current methods aren't including the very latest science. The IPCC guidance also allows for several different levels of complexity in the methods it develops. Countries are expected to use more accurate methods if they have the capacity to do so, like the US. Generally speaking, the simplest methods involve using emissions factor that link the rate at which a source emits greenhouse gases per unit of activity. So an example could be an emissions factor linking emissions from landfill to population density. While emissions factor can be very useful to estimate emissions from a particular activity when facility-specific data is not available, in this case, where we're linking landfill emissions to population, it does run the risk of making population decline as the most effective emission reduction measure. And if the jurisdiction took actions to reduce emissions from its landfills, the inventory would not necessarily reflect the impact of those actions on the emissions. More accurate methods require either data collected locally or complex modeling studies. Okay, since a portion of the emissions from international aviation and shipping occur over international waters, these emissions do not fit neatly into the territorial approach of production-based accounting. So on the map here on the left, we can see CO2 emissions from international aviation in 2018, where the emissions are assigned to the country that sold the fuel. Indeed, fuel that is purchased in the US but used for international transportation is called international bunker fuel. Emissions from international bunker fuels are reported for informational purposes in national inventories, but they are not counted in totals. And this is following Paris Agreement reporting obligations. Since these emissions are not under the purview of any one country, 2 UN organizations have been tasked to coordinate emissions reduction in the sectors of international aviation and maritime shipping. And those are the International Civil Aviation Organization and the International Maritime Organization. Okay. As we saw in the US emissions inventory, energy production is responsible for the lion's share of greenhouse gas emission. And so we can improve on the comprehensiveness of production-based accounting methods by reporting emissions from electricity produced elsewhere but used in the region, keeping all other sectors the same as in the production-based methods. In the Northwest, we call this type of emissions inventory methods sector-based accounting. Usefully, sector-based accounting involves only limited added complexity compared to production-based methods because data about electricity production is relatively accessible. Jurisdictions may also be able to influence electricity consumption even if it's produced elsewhere, so it makes sense to report electricity emissions in this way. While this method does offer improvements relative to production-based accounting, it may still fail to capture carbon leakage from the import of other carbon-intensive products. Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington all use a sector-based accounting method for their state inventory. Since Idaho and Montana have not updated their inventory in more than 14 years, let's consider Oregon and Washington. A portion of the electricity used in Oregon is generated by coal and natural gas facilities located outside of the state. For this reason, a sector-based inventory allows a more comprehensive view of the impact of the state of Oregon on global warming. As we can see in the Oregon sector-based inventory here on the left, for the years 1990 to 2016, electricity generation in the dark blue is the second most important contributor to emissions in Oregon, just after transportation. Similarly, in the case of Washington, electric utilities serve Washington customers using electricity from coal-fired plants in Montana and Wyoming. And so the emissions due to electricity, this is like the top bar of the plot, are significant. Despite both Oregon and Washington using the same state inventory tool developed by the federal government to produce their inventories, there's still a lot of flexibility in how each state chooses to report emissions. Categories with similar names may be defined differently, and the underlying data may be either top-down, so that usually means disaggregated national values, or bottom-up from local reporting programs. An example of that, in Oregon, you can see this light blue category sector here called natural gas. This is from the combustion of natural gas on-site at factories or other industrial properties. You can see it is reported separately in the case of Oregon, but in the case of Washington, it is included in this residential, commercial, industrial sector. Also, biogenic emissions are not included here, unlike for the US inventory. While Oregon and Washington produce sector-based emissions inventories where only the electricity is treated on a consumption basis, increasingly, jurisdictions are producing inventories where other sources, such as waste or HFCs, which are non-CO2 greenhouse gas, are also based on consumption instead of production. The last jurisdictional accounting method is called consumption-based accounting. For this method, boundaries are based on the life cycle emissions of consumed energy, goods, etc., even if the emissions are produced elsewhere in the world. This type of emissions inventory estimates all greenhouse gas emissions associated with the group's consumption. So that's both pre- and post-consumer use, thereby capturing the broader impact of a jurisdiction's activities, as well as the effects of potential carbon leakage. About 25% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions are linked to the production of goods traded across borders. And so this is why we care about this carbon leakage issue. Creating inventories with this added comprehensiveness comes with a need for additional data, time, and expertise, which can lead to added uncertainty in the resulting inventory and potentially delayed results. Also, this type of accounting may not reveal emissions related to production on the territory of a jurisdiction if the production is exported to external consumers, even though this local production could be usefully targeted for emissions decrease by the government. This creates issues because it is also challenging for a jurisdiction to regulate most emissions produced outside of its territory. And so consumption-based inventories, while able to capture the broader climate impact of a jurisdiction, are usually considered side by side with production or sector-based inventories. Oregon produces both a sector-based and consumption-based greenhouse gas inventory, and it was the first state in the US to do so. The figure on the right here shows Oregon's consumption-based inventory. We can see that it is separated in several categories. So each category has their own bar here, and then also each category has their part of the pie chart on the right here. We see that the category with the most associated emission is vehicles and parts. So that includes all the life cycle emissions from vehicles. So supply chain, production, transportation, etc. The color of the bar shows which part of the life cycle is responsible for the emissions. So it could be pre-purchase in dark blue, it could be use of the product in light blue, or it could be post-consumer disposal in green. For the vehicles and part category, we can see that use is the dominant subcategory, and this makes a lot of sense as use would include emissions from fuel combustion to power the vehicles. However, for the food and beverage category, the second most important, we can see that nearly all emissions are from pre-purchase. So that would be food production emissions and transportation to the retail space. While Oregon is currently the only Northwest state with a consumption-based inventory, Washington is currently working on producing one as well, due to be released in spring 2025. A second example, King County also produces both a production-based and consumption-based inventory. In contrast with Oregon, King County reports its consumption-based emissions for an average King County household. So the scale on the y-axis here is much smaller. The county first determines an estimate of consumption for each King County household, which they characterize using several variables like household size, income, or vehicle ownership. Then the county applies a model trained on US-wide survey data that bridges the gap between dollars spent and emissions. Once they have the emissions for each household, they take an average. And this is what we see in the figure on the right. We can see that they separate the emissions in 5 categories. So we have transportation, housing, food, goods, and services. We can see that transportation and food are the biggest categories, with gasoline combustion in vehicles and healthcare being the 2 most significant subcategories. Finally, these numbers do not include government emissions, which are significant. If we were to add an additional bar on this graph for government emissions, it would be about as big as this green goods category here. All right, so we have explored the different methods used by national and subnational governments to produce emissions inventories. We saw that each method has their own strength and limitations, and each method provides different but complementary information on a jurisdiction's impact on global warming. In this summary Venn diagram here, we can see the overlap between the different jurisdictional accounting methods. The blue circle here represent production-based accounting. So emissions are counted if they are produced inside the geographical boundaries of a region. The red circle here represents consumption-based accounting. This is where emissions are counting according to who the consumers are. We can see that this circle is bigger because consumption-based emissions are usually much higher than production-based emission. Finally, we can easily see that sector-based accounting is a combination of production and consumption-based accounting, where emissions from electricity production are counted based on consumption, but all other sectors are counted like production. And so this concludes our section on jurisdictional emissions accounting. Next, let's talk about corporate emissions accounting. So corporations use methods that are different from jurisdictional approaches to determine the emissions for their organizational footprints. The motivation for producing an emissions inventory can be either voluntary or due to required disclosure. Nonprofits, government agencies, and universities also sometimes use these accounting techniques. Corporate carbon footprint software emerged in the 2000s after the first edition of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Corporate Standard was published in 2001. In the 2010s, companies increasingly adopted voluntary emissions accounting practices as a result of investor and customer interest in transparency. This interest has continued to increase to this day, with more than 18,700 companies submitting climate disclosures via the Voluntary Carbon Disclosure Project, or CDP, in 2022. There are also mandatory climate disclosure regulation in several countries around the world. The map shown here shows nations with adopted or proposed mandatory reporting legislation. Some of these policies may require only large emitting companies to report emissions. However, recently, the EU and the US have taken steps to require broader corporate climate disclosure. The US Securities and Exchange Commission adopted rules in March 2024 requiring companies to disclose climate-related risks, activities to mitigate those risks, and climate-related financial expenditures. The fate of this rule is a little unclear now, given US politics. The EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive also came into effect in 2024. Corporate emissions accounting allows us to compile and attribute emissions to individual corporations based on their direct and indirect emissions. It gives a picture of how and where companies contribute to greenhouse gas emissions and enables a broad comparison between individual companies and across industries. However, there is a lack of precise comparability between corporations due to flexibility in how methodologies are applied from one company to another and from one sector to another. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol provides the most widely used standards and guidance for companies to develop inventories. Emissions are separated into 3 categories, which are illustrated in the figure on the right here. Scope 1 emissions are direct emissions resulting from a corporation's activities. So, from sources owned and controlled by the company, highlighting their immediate environmental impact. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions resulting from purchased energies. So any purchased electricity, for example, would be counted as Scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are all other indirect emissions resulting from the company's activities. So that includes the use of manufactured products, their disposal at the end of their lifetime, the manufacture of purchased materials, or services like airplane travel. The example of Scope 1 and 3 categories that I mentioned here are illustrative and not an exhaustive list. There are more, but these are some of the most common. Both Scope 2 and 3 emissions originate from sources under the ownership or control of another entity, and so reflect a broader shared responsibility in mitigating climate change. Since one organization's Scope 3 emissions will be made up of the Scope 1 emissions from other entities. And so addressing Scope 3 emissions often necessitates collaboration with various stakeholders and businesses throughout the value chain. A good place to look for corporate emissions inventories is in a corporation's sustainability report. This is a graph of Microsoft's emissions inventory from its 2024 sustainability report. We can see the company's Scope 1 emissions, which originate from direct greenhouse gas emissions from on-site fossil fuel combustion, executive air travel, ground transportation from Microsoft-owned vehicles, and HFC and SF6 used at some facilities. Those are two different non-CO2 greenhouse gas. Scope 2 emissions are also visible in gray still. These are emissions from purchased electricity, chilled water, and steam that show up here. Finally, Scope 3 emissions are clearly the main part of the pie here, representing 96.5% of Microsoft emissions. We can see that the biggest contributors to Microsoft Scope 3 emissions are purchased goods and services, capital goods, and use of sold products. Corporations are able to take credit for decarbonized energy that they finance, even if they don't take physical possession of the green alternatives they support. This is because on a shared grid, the physical electricity they receive does not indicate its origin or how it was generated. To maintain transparency, while recognizing corporate efforts to accelerate market development of critical carbon reduction solutions, corporations report Scope 2 emissions as both location-based and market-based, as we can see here from Microsoft's 2024 Environmental Sustainability Report data fact sheet. The location-based value is based on the average emissions factor for the electricity grids that provide electricity to their data centers, buildings, and campuses. And so the emission factor relates the average amount of emissions for the electricity mix for each or by kilowatt hour. We can see here that it is significantly higher than the market-based value. This is because in the market-based method, they also capture the impact from on-site renewable energy generation, power purchase agreements, the purchase of unbundled energy attribute certificates, and green power products. So basically all of Microsoft's investment in decarbonized electricity. Since Microsoft has set a target to procure enough direct renewable electricity to cover 100% of their electricity usage by 2025, they're strongly investing in decarbonized electricity, and we can see that in this market-based value. In a similar idea, the greenhouse gas accounting standard community is also considering allowing companies to take credit for sustainable aviation fuel that they contribute to an airport's tank farm to offset their emissions related to plane travel. Okay, so we have seen the different methods that jurisdictions and corporations use to produce greenhouse gas emissions inventories. It's important to note that across all these emissions accounting methods, inventories have different degrees of accuracy, depending on the available resources and data. The different greenhouse gas accounting methodologies have also been designed for different objectives, and we cannot mix and match different methods. Issues can also arise with how the methods are put into practice, as opposed to flaws in the methods themselves. Finally, we have relatively high confidence in emissions of CO2 from fossil fuels and industry. but non-CO2 emissions, land sector emissions, supply chain emissions, and carbon offsets are harder to estimate reliably. Looking ahead, policymakers in the European Union and in the US have taken steps to require corporate disclosure of emissions, which is a good step forward. And global experts have openly acknowledged the need for public and private sector greenhouse gas accounting to interact more seamlessly. Although not a panacea, technology is also accelerating innovations in greenhouse gas data collection, including automated data collection and analysis, which can reduce input time and potential human error, error correction, and reliability improvement through artificial intelligence-enabled data checking, analysis of supply chain hotspots and recommendations for improvements, and finally, greenhouse gas emissions satellite detection, tracking, and open sharing, such as by Climate Trace. With Climate Trace, we're now able to detect emissions of greenhouse gases using satellites and other remote sensing methods. And so this is an example on this map here. I've zoomed into the US, and we can clearly identify big population centers by their emissions. So, for example, emissions due to power generation in this kind of teal color. We can see a lot of that in the eastern US, or emissions from transportation in yellow along the coast here. Looking ahead, public and private leaders will need to strengthen their pictures of greenhouse gas emissions to make sound decisions about how to reduce their footprints in line with global climate targets. But emissions inventories will continue to be a critical tool to understand progress towards emissions reduction goals. All right, this comes to the end of the main part of the presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. Before we move on to the question period, I would like to ask you to once again answer a short survey. This is a new QR code, and there will be a new link in the chat for the post-presentation survey. As a reminder, the survey will be used to evaluate the effectiveness of my communication for my capstone project. So please take the next 5 minutes to answer the survey at this new link. Thank you.
Just letting you all know that while you're doing that, we are organizing the questions as best we can, and we will get through as many as we can in the 15 minutes that we'll have remaining. And any that we don't get to, we will write up a Q&A document and publish it with all of the materials.
Thank you everyone for participating, and we will now move on to the Q&A.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions. We've been trying to triage them back here. And I don't know if you've had a chance to look at any of them, Jade, during that 5 minutes, but I'm going to try and combine a couple. There have been a bunch of questions early on about methane. And
Okay.
so how is methane removed from the atmosphere? And also whether the warming effect developed by methane is trapped by the CO2 in the atmosphere, or if the heat disappears when the methane leaves the atmosphere. Did you look into this in your research, or should we follow up separately on this question?
I can answer some aspects of that question. To touch briefly on the first aspect, I'm not familiar with any methods currently on how to actually remove methane from the atmosphere ourselves. I think there may be some research starting to look into how we could do that, but people mostly focus on technology to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, since the CO2 will stay for so much longer than the methane. It's a little bit more efficient in the long term to concentrate on removing CO2. And for the question whether the heat, if I remember correctly, is the heat from methane kept in the atmosphere by CO2? Is that correct?
Actually, is the heat developed by methane trapped by the CO2 in the atmosphere, or does the heat disappear when the methane leaves the atmosphere?
Okay, so
And yeah, as Kate was
thank you, Eileen. That makes sense. So basically the short answer would be yes and no, right? So you can think of a molecule of methane and a molecule of CO2 in the atmosphere kind of doing the same job, just methane does it more effectively. So as long as methane is in the atmosphere, it will prevent heat from escaping to space. And the same can be said for CO2. It's just that the difference is that the molecule of CO2 will just stay in the atmosphere for centuries, still keeping heat in, whereas the molecule of methane eventually, through natural processes that occur in the atmosphere, will be taken out of the atmosphere and so won't be there anymore to prevent heat from escaping into the atmosphere. And so, in a way, yes, the heat that's being kept in by methane is also being kept in by CO2, but I think probably that's not quite the right way to see it. It's just you can see it as both the methane molecule and the CO2 molecule contribute to, the greenhouse effect. They're both part of the greenhouse, but the methane eventually gets removed, and so then more of the heat gets to escape into space, whereas CO2 just stays in the atmosphere for centuries.
Okay. You talked about the GWP 100 measurement. Is there a GWP 25 or other shorter time frame measurement, or is the 100 the only one that's used commonly?
Yes, thank you for that question. Yeah, that's an excellent point. You can indeed calculate a GWP for any kind of time scale that you want. It could be 10 years, it could be 25 years, and you would indeed get very different results, particularly for methane, right? If you did a GWP 10, for methane would be even higher because in these first 10 years, right, methane is very, very efficient at keeping heat into the atmosphere. I presented GWP 100 because currently most methods make use of GWP 100 to convert between CO2 emissions and non-CO2 emissions. So for example, the Paris Agreement uses GWP 100. And there are also newer metrics that haven't really been adopted as much. One is called GWP star. And this one is specifically for short-lived greenhouse gases like methane, to be a little bit more representative of the fact that after about a decade, methane is being slowly, naturally taken out of the atmosphere. And so GWP star tries to take this into account, kind of the time varying aspect. But it has other, limitations, and so far has not really been adopted.
Marty Gibbonson asked a while back, are transportation emissions included within energy accounting? They certainly are.
Yes, so in the US submission, definitely the Paris Agreement US submission, the energy sector includes generations of all energy. So yes, burning fossil fuel in cars, that counts as energy. Just or like heating up your home, burning fossil fuel in to heat up your home, that would also count as energy.
An interesting, challenging question. You touched on data quality issues or differences by jurisdiction and how they differ, top down versus bottom up. How much of a barrier does this pose to comparison and analysis? This contributor was specifically thinking about BC versus Washington versus Oregon differences. And I also recall seeing somewhere else in the questions, this question about how can we compare Washington and can we compare Washington and Oregon's? And then there was another really interesting idea. I think this is it. Is there a single data source with all these assessments and the ability to filter by different approaches and map differences? So 3 in one place here.
Yes, this is thank you for this question. It's, I think, one of the main challenges with emissions accounting, right? It is a very complex things to do. It requires so much data. I mean, it would be great if we had all the data for everywhere, everyone everywhere, and so that we could compare very easily. I think it's a real challenge, and it's one of the main limitations I think that I found when I did the research for this presentation, that actually it is quite challenging to compare even state to state, or like I mentioned, like even Oregon and Washington, comparing them together, even though they were made using the same tool, there are still significant differences. I think it's important to keep in mind that they are different usually because uh, the people who are making the inventories, like they don't necessarily have a choice. Like perhaps the data doesn't exist. Perhaps they're just one person working, there's like limited capacity for these things. But definitely there are improvements that could be made in terms of like integrating, for example, corporate and jurisdictional accounting, incorporating them together. And people have proposed ideas of, for example, modeling on the financial sector, where you do have to disclose. I don't know too much about the financial sector, but I know that companies have to disclose their finances, and there are ways that it is integrated, like internationally speaking, and people are proposing that perhaps we could do that for climate disclosures. It has not been done yet, and I don't think there's any resources where you can easily go and see and compare. In terms of specifically comparing state emissions to each other, I haven't mentioned it in the presentation, but on top of the official state inventories, for example, for Washington and Oregon, there also exists a disaggregated national inventory where the US at the federal level, they produce their own, US-wide inventory, but they also disaggregate that at the state level. And so then they do use the same, as much as possible, the same methods for all the different states that they do. So if you really needed to compare apples to apples, you could look at that. But it will be different from the state official inventory. So it's something else to keep in mind.
I would just add that the Clean Energy Transition Institute has a lot of experience with this because we've been working on state energy strategies for the last 5 or 6 years, and there's a lot of differences among and between. Okay, let's see. Would consumption, this was on slide 25 specifically, would consumption-based accounting include international fuels?
Yes, it would in this case. International bunker fuels are included in consumption-based inventory. So they would be assigned to the person basically taking the flight. If I fly to Tokyo, Japan, and I live in Seattle, well, the emissions from that flight, my portion of it would be assigned to Washington State inventory, for example. Obviously, people who make consumption-based inventories aren't like tracking everybody's emissions that precisely, right? So there would be an estimate made of how much Washingtonians travel by plane. So that's when like these emissions factor come into play to try to estimate these values, which are quite hard to exactly pin down.
This one was on slide 28. It seems like jurisdictions might use either sector or production-based accounting and consumption-based accounting, but it wouldn't make sense to use sector and production-based accounting at the same time.
Yes, that is correct. Most people don't, or most jurisdictions don't use both because indeed they are pretty similar in the information that they give you. And yeah, that's why they were like separate examples. So
Right.
Washington and Oregon don't produce a production-based inventory.
On slide 31, would burning natural gas at a factory to produce glass count as scope 1 or 2 emissions? Gas purchased from a distribution company but burned on site.
If you're burning the natural gas in your facility, if the burning really happens, on your facility, then it would be scope 1 emissions. Only energy that is so for scope 2, it's energy that's produced elsewhere but used in at your facility. So if you burned natural gas to produce electricity and then purchased electricity, then it would be scope 2. But if you're doing the burning yourself, then it's scope 1.
We may not know the answer to this one, but what is the precision of the satellite emission measurements?
Yeah, good question. I don't know like actual numbers, but I do know that they claim to be able to assign it to a specific facility. And you can zoom in pretty far in on that map. This is just like a screenshot. But if you go on the website, you can zoom in and they have identified like, oh, this is this one specific electricity generation plant.
Patrick, I see you also had your hand raised, so I don't know if your hand is raised for a different question, but I've just come to your question here in the queue. What are the best methods and data sources for estimating the quantity and persistence of sequestered carbon in agriculture and forestry sectors? And I don't know if Elizabeth may want to address this too, but
The best methods to, I'm not sure. I didn't quite cover that. I think in my own research, I would hazard a guess that it'd probably be models because it's quite hard to measure land sector emissions. But maybe Elizabeth.
I don't know if you have anything you want to add. This is a topic for our next one of our next decarbonization forums that Elizabeth's working on. So I think maybe we'll leave that one for the future. And definitely let you know, Patrick, when that one's coming on. Isabella Murray writes, hi, I was wondering how our green wastes are dealt with in Washington State and if this waste management affects greenhouse gas emissions.
Green waste, so I'm thinking like you're raking leaves on your lawn and then putting them in the trash. Is that the kind of idea that we're thinking of?
Yeah, Isabella, I'm wondering, should we
I
take Isabella off when we hear from Isabella or type again? We have only 2 more minutes, so I'm also looking at the rest of these questions. I was going sort of straight. Let me see, regarding makeup base.
Well, I'll just say a few notes about that. Green waste is considered usually biogenic emissions, and so they can be counted separately depending like what inventories you're making.
Well, there are different commercial waste, garbage, recycled plastics, green waste, metals, et cetera, inventoried for their waste management impact in these emissions inventories, or are they lumped together when inventoried and their impact on emissions? And then I guess you were saying branches, leaves, and other biowaste. So you had 2 questions, Isabella.
Okay, a few things come to mind. I know that the US has had for a while a regulation that big emitters have to report their emissions. That also includes waste facilities, so landfills and things like that. So I think we have some data about that, which isn't exactly answering your question there, but that's a thought. And then, yeah, green waste. So landfill emissions, depending exactly which inventory you're talking about, but for the US submission to the Paris Agreement, so if you have green waste decomposing in a landfill, that's counted as biogenic emissions and is put separately, but then you can have other things in landfills also emitting, so like plastics and stuff. There's also emissions of non-biogenic emissions in landfills there.
I'm going to stop you, Jay, because we're at time.
Okay.
And I'm just going to say that we will get back to you, everybody who participated, and give you the full answers to all questions that weren't answered and others as well. I want to thank Jade and everybody for joining us. Jamie's going to put into the chat a link to our website where you can find an emissions accounting 101 document. You'll also find the answers to the questions in the survey at the beginning, except number 5. If you'd like to see them. We will post the recording of this webinar today and all the slides. And we've talked about some of the topics we're going to look at in the future. We'd love for you to sign up for our newsletter if you're not already on it. You'll also see when you exit out of the webinar that you'll be directed to a window in your browser where you can share your feedback on how we did today. We are committed to continuous improvement here at CETI, and we greatly value your input. I know you've already taken 2 surveys, so if you're done, I understand. But if you're inclined, maybe take a minute to tell us how we did. And finally, on behalf of the CETI board and team, and especially Jade Sauvé, Jamie Patajic, Ruby Moore Bloom, and Elizabeth Wilmot, and Aster Lee, I want to thank you so much for attending today's webinar. We deeply appreciate your interest in accelerating an equitable clean energy transition in the Northwest.